Welcome, everybody, to the J3 University podcast. With me, as always, co-host Luke Miller. Luke, how's it going?
Good, man. Ready to rock today.
Right on. And we have a very special guest with us today, Dr. Eric Helms, Chief Science Officer of Team 3 DMJ, and Sports Physiology and Nutrition Research Fellow for AUT at the Sport Performance Research Institute in New Zealand, and writer for Mass Research Review. Also, Eric has a few really good books on nutrition and training available if you want to check those out. And I've been a fan and follower of Eric for a while. I think he does an excellent job of bringing science into the trenches and also knowing where those limitations are. So we have a lot of guys that start stretching the science into the trenches and into the empirical world. And Eric, I think you've done an excellent job of like knowing where the research ends and what we could say about that. And then, but also you have a lot of real world experience too, because Eric is a pro natural bodybuilder, getting his pro card in 2011. And I think you dabble in powerlifting as well. That all sound right? Was that a good intro for you, Eric?
It's fantastic.
Beautiful.
Couldn't have done a better job myself, and I wouldn't have wanted to because I would have been uncomfortable. So I really appreciate that.
Cool. So we are venturing into this whole, hot topic on refeeds, and this has been come about from like Bill Campbell's paper, looking at his more recent refeed research, and then there was Jackson Pios and his research group were kind of like digging through the statistical analysis and looking at some of the methods and saying that, like, oh, this refeeds might not be as beneficial as what they thought, at least for retaining muscle retention or even maintaining basal metabolic rate. But there could be some advantages to it. But yet we've been doing this stuff for a long time, these refeeds. Back when I first did them, I was powerlifting. I probably had no application to me, but it was Mauro Di Pasquale's cyclic ketogenic diet. And it was basically you run like a keto diet for, I forget how long you do it for. Then you have like a day or two, just high carbohydrates. And that was a long time ago for me. There's always been some application of it throughout bodybuilding. Currently it's very much implemented throughout natural bodybuilding, pro bodybuilding. You have refeeds in place, and we see benefits of these things. Like there's something happening, but we just haven't had a lot of research and evidence into what's the reasons behind these things and how do we explain them? Is it just, makes the prep itself appear easier, or is it actually having a physiological benefit? So that's what we want to dive in today with you, Dr. Eric Helms. So if you have some insight into maybe we should just define for you refeeds, diet breaks. What are these things? And just to get some basis around that for our listeners.
Absolutely. I think you did a great job teeing that up because, Fred Hatfield talking about the zigzag diet. I remember when I first got my ISSA certification, like 16 years ago now. I remember reading about that and thought that was interesting. You hear stories of carb cycling going back to the 90s, if not even the late 80s. UD2, we want to talk about Lyle McDonald, and before that, Body Opus, we want to talk about Dan Duchesne. It has been embedded in the physique world for as long as you could call the modern era. And I would not be surprised if it wasn't around in some form before that as well. So clearly that anecdote has held up over time. And that's not to say that all anecdotes, there's a lot of things that have held up over time in various sectors that are not even helpful, but potentially harmful. But I think this is one of those that I've seen across a lot of different groups within the physique world, with different levels of care about science, and different levels of paying attention and different levels of, following tradition embedded into the way they approach things. And they do often land on going, there's something here. That's certainly been my experience, but of course I do, think, okay, that's interesting. What's going on here? And that's kind of the framing I have with the research. We tried to define our terms here a little bit in a recent paper that I wrote with, that was led by Brandon Roberts and also Peter Fitchen, myself and Eric Trexler are on it. So it's really just like the natties trying to just kind of like shoehorn this and make it our own. It's just kind of another instance of the overstep of the Illuminati movement. But if you can get past that, institutional bias, I think there was some usefulness in there. So there was a figure where we kind of described, hey, here's all the strategies of nonlinear dieting, all the way from like a cheat meal to a diet break. And we talked about the theoretical potential of all of them, moving from least likely to have a physiological benefit to most, with the more time spent out of a deficit, and the more controlled and regimented it was, kind of moving towards the other side as well. So cheat meals have been around for forever, and I think embedded in the name of the cheat meal, it kind of just implies that we're not necessarily trying to get a whole lot more accomplished than having the opportunity to eat a cheeseburger while I'm dying. And, like, fair call, like, I'm fine with that. And I think that's been worked in as a sanity strategy in bodybuilding for the longest time across, all sectors and all divisions. And I think in the more modern era, when you talk about the utility of this as a strategy, certain things start to change. More commonly, you'll see that the goal is to eat at maintenance rather than necessarily putting yourself into a large surplus. And it's not about necessarily cheating. It is seen as something that should have similar levels of structure, control, and quantitative assessment and tracking that your low days do. And that's kind of like at 3DMJ, the way we frame them is often low days and high days, because I think that conveys a certain commonality between the thing that leads to different thinking and framing of the diet. So the rationale, and I will say it is theoretical at this point, because like you said, there's controversy in the utility of these within the evidence-based community, and I'd say for good reason.
And you'd probably say just lack of evidence too for our population, right? Because a lot of this other research is more obese, overweight, and we just have maybe just one or two studies in like leaner individuals, but not contest lean individuals, right?
Yeah, so I would say, like, if we kind of trace the evidence back, we have some behavioral stuff, which is pretty interesting. And then we have some physiological stuff, but all the physiological stuff is adjacent to what we might care about as contest prep coaches and competitors. So for example, there's Durlawanger, I'm always sure I'm mispronouncing that, where it's like a 3-day carb refeed. They look at leptin levels, they look at energy expenditure. But what they did is they took people who weren't dieted, weren't bodybuilders, of course, and they weren't in a deficit, and they took them from maintenance to overfeeding carbohydrates and calories for 3 days, and they went, this increased energy expenditure a small amount, and leptin and BMR 7%. Maybe this isn't worth it. And I'm going, I mean, they weren't really dieting. This is interesting. This is an overfeeding study. So that's like similar. And then, like you said, we do have a fair amount of what collectively falls under intermittent fasting, which is different in the academic research than the intermittent fasting we associate with kind of like the 16-8 strategy of just skipping breakfast, really. And that encompasses a whole realm of stuff from the 5 and 2 diet, which is like I diet on 2 days, or alternate day fasting, where you like have minimal calories, if it may be none on other days, and all that stuff. And there's hits and misses there. Like if you look at the systematic reviews of all of those strategies collectively, they don't do better than just straight caloric restriction on a daily caloric restriction. However, is intermittent caloric restriction, which is probably, in my opinion, a better catch-all terminology, should that be seen as a monolith? And I would say probably not. And that's why we kind of created that spectrum. So like there is stuff on everything from diet breaks to refeeds now, but it is quite limited. And the rationale for why we set out, for why it maybe makes a little more sense to expect more of an effect when you're spending a longer time in or out of a deficit, I should say, is because of the known temporal aspect of being out of a status of low energy availability. So it makes intuitive sense physiologically that simply getting a lot of calories all at once would not necessarily have the same effect of having the presence of it over a long period. And we do see the effects of this indirectly on the hormonal system in some of the case studies we see of female bodybuilders. We see this in some studies on LH pulsatility, which is a marker of menstrual cycle regularity. When you give one big bolus of energy to someone who has been on low calories and they're starting to show signs of menstrual disruption, compared to when you give them like maintenance calories for multiple days. And it is the latter that seems to restore the normality of LH pulsatility. And I'm referring to some studies in the 90s by Olson, and I want to say Luke's, but it might not be. It's almost always a safe bet if you're talking about menstrual cycle to say Luke's, so I'm probably just copying out. But there's a couple studies that kind of show that. And, you know, it makes sense from the perspective of if we were to kind of put our armchair evolutionary biology hat on, like, you know, if we come across a finite source of food, we probably don't want to upregulate everything in physiology that allows the tribe to have more children and then starve, right? So that's obviously not like hardcore proof, but there are a lot of instances. Another one, there's a case study of a female natural figure competitor who they talk about her post-contest strategy. That is, she was doing a controlled kind of probably overly restrictive reverse diet. And it took her, I think, 6+ months to gain 5 kilos. That's like 11 pounds, not much. And did not get her menstrual cycle back for 1.5 years. So was objectively in a surplus, put on 5 kilos, but it was probably in this kind of stop-start fashion that we often see, this kind of yo-yo diet. Oh, I got too loose, oh, I need to tighten up. I got too loose, I need to tighten up. So going in and out of a status of, I'd say, sufficient energy availability. So we see that on the way down. And we see that some echoes on the way up. So the idea is that, well, if I give you just one day, or we give you a bunch of, you know, carbs and calories, that'll have some effects, but it may not have those knock-on effects on the overall system, like a refeed or a multi-day refeed or a diet break might have. So that was our theoretical assessment. Now, how that's playing out in the research is not necessarily as cut and dry. So to give a big shout out to Jackson Pios, and I can only go into some depth with this. So he's doing his PhD, he's nearly finished on doing diet breaks in athletes who are reasonably lean and testing. He's doing a fantastic job. Some of the best research that's been done in this area. And there's also stuff coming out with Bill Campbell. He's collaborating with Menno Henselman. So there's a lot of people looking at this. And the Campbell finding, I think, is a little more straightforward than some of the more critical assessments of it are, even when you do an intention to treat analysis, even when you strictly use statistical significant differences as kind of the line in the sand, you still did see a dry fat-free mass difference favoring the 2-day refeed group, you know, and the p-value wasn't even close to not being significant. And you kind of like, if the argument is, well, the measurement, we're not sure, it could have resulted in just being water, then we have to actually assume that the method they did to control for water retention actually made it worse, which doesn't really make intuitive sense. So there wasn't a difference in regular lean body mass, but there was a dry fat-free mass. Okay, that's due to water. That doesn't really logically hold up for me. So we see this 2-day refeed potentially having an impact on fat-free mass and some very small negligible differences between groups in energy expenditure, RMR. But then I think the reason why Jackson has some skepticism, and I don't want to put words in his mouth, we've talked about this, is he's not necessarily seeing the same thing when he's doing a full week-long diet break. So it's difficult, I think, for him, and this is a reasonable level of skepticism, to go, all right, if we have this understanding that the more time you spent out of a deficit, it should have a greater impact, then why don't I see it with a week-long diet break, but it was observed in a 2-day refeed? So right now, we don't have a good answer to that, but I would also caution everyone to not try to make conclusions when we have like 3 studies, because how many times in various areas of research did 1 or 2 studies show a false negative or a false positive? And you know, it's not until we're 5-6 years in and have double-digit number of studies where we can see that trend. So that's kind of where we are at now. We have the physiological rationale, which is a great place to start, that says, you know, there's that temporal effect, and there is an effect of pulling someone out of an energy deficit. And it may be useful in the process of where, you know, in the end, we all got to get to the point where we got lines in our ass. there is no avoiding the spiral of the drain. And no matter how you dice it, you feel like shit at a certain point, and things get negatively affected. But can we mitigate that for as long as possible? Some of the anecdotal things that I have noticed is that when we use some of these nonlinear dieting strategies in women, they're able to hold on to their menstrual cycle far longer than when we just dieted them straight through, which tells me like these are not disconnected systems, right? So something is going on there. Whether it has effects outside of that, I think that's still up in the air, but I think that to me is quite interesting. And I know I've kind of jumped everywhere, so I'm going to shut up a little bit and let you guys redirect my my scattered brain.
No, there was flow to the scatter. I think it paints a good picture of where we're at evidence-wise, that we've come from this. Definitely, a lot of this stuff always comes from in the trenches. Hey, we're noticing this. Let's go test it in the research field. And then we have some studies that have already kind of done this and led us to this point of saying, well, let's see in these lean individuals, because we see everyone applying it. And that's what Bill Campbell has done, because he asked real lifters, real bodybuilders, hey, what do y'all do? Interesting. Let me go study this. And so now we finally actually have what was kind of like the first study that was a very applicable approach that we see a lot of people implement. And for those that aren't familiar, this Bill Campbell study was, I believe, was it 8 week long, or is it longer than that?
It was either 7 plus some measurement time, or it might have been 8 weeks in total.
Yeah. So this 7 to 8 week period, one group for 5 days would be at a 35% calorie deficit, and then 2 days they would bring calories up to maintenance, mainly an increase in carbohydrate, which is very similar to what we do when we are implementing refeeds. And then the other group just ran a straight 7-day deficit, 25% calorie deficit every single day. So the calories were equated, which is a great thing, because a lot of the other research we have, it's not very realistic, because sometimes it's like I saw one study, I think it was in one with females you're mentioning, that was like a 90 kcal per kilogram 1 day feeding. Like it was this, enormous amount that would probably kick you out of your deficit for a few weeks potentially. So so this was kind of like our first insight into this, and having more research. So I think this year should be exciting for our refeeds in lean individuals. And so we have some early evidence of what this might do in muscle mass retention and have a benefit within that. And we kind of have to step from, well, we have this in the research. How can we actually take that and apply it into what we're doing now? Or are we already applying it in the way that we should be? I guess those would be the questions that I've brought up, because I've applied it in many different ways. I've had these large day refeeds in previous contest preps, which, anecdotally and just what I observe, it's usually it brings my body weight very, very high. I have more days before I get back into that deficit. And also digestion can be quite disrupted just from larger food volumes, which I don't know if that's something that we have certain things we're measuring in a research study, right? We're not measuring everything that could be a potential rationale for why we would be implementing this type of strategy. So I guess, Eric, that's what I would bring up to you, is that we have these markers, like the hard markers, right? Like lean body mass or body fat that you can measure. But what about the markers that we haven't measured in implementing refeeds for people that want some type of takeaway? Like, hey, if this doesn't work, or maybe it does, we don't have the best evidence for it. What might be some of the other markers to measure in the studies, or that we should be implementing before, whether it be adherence or ease of prep or digestion? What do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I like the way you frame that. There's a really cool study that Mitchell did out of University of Sydney, where they did qualitative interviews. This is something that I think is probably too absent from the field of any type of nutrition, considering how much nutrition affects lifestyle and has all these knock-on physiological effects. Qualitative research asks people open-ended questions, either in person or to write down, about their experiences. So the things that we can't necessarily quantify. And the analysis of them is that we look for themes across people, and you present them in a de-identified manner. So this Mitchell questionnaire, I want to say, was done in 2017. Full disclosure, I was one of the participants. So my anecdotes and biases are embedded in that. I'm not like the only participant. Isn't just like I'm publishing it, me talking to Eric. But I was one of, I think, a double-digit number of bodybuilders. Most of them, I think, were natural competitive bodybuilders. So again, the Illuminati influence. But the reported things from that group of people did range outside of their perceptions and beliefs around metabolism. So they noticed things like more consistent weight loss, which could be related to water retention. That's something I think if I was really going to try to, steel man the other position and think, well, what could my anecdotes be being explained by? As a small side tangent, in the Illuminati community, like I talked about before, we've always been very dismissive historically of the idea of water retention. I think for one, there's probably a little bit less of it when we're not actually manipulating our hormones to a large degree. And any discussion of water retention immediately kind of gets dumped into our, oh, you mean we should be cutting water for peaking? And someone's like, no, I didn't even say that. And then, you get the barrage of you're an idiot and the condescension, without actually thinking about it. And that's changed for the better over time. But one of the things that as I, got deconditioned and I stopped drinking as much Kool-Aid, I still only have like one sip a day. I've started to realize like water retention does happen a fair amount, like we look at these huge changes in body weight from carb loading and around refeed. Some people drop weight immediately, some people gain weight, and you have to go, what's going on there? And something that Alberto describes, to me, like when he was prepping me in 2019, he's like, we need to do a refeed. You look like somebody jumped you in an alley, just I look puffy and gross and like I just got some water retention. I have a refeed and there's a little bit of a lag as overall body, water goes up from eating carbs, and I still kind of have whatever that stress response is that's making me look like I was a victim of crime. And then it starts to drop off and I look far better. And it's the combination of what we think is losing some of that water retention and having, higher levels of glycogen. So I would love to see some greater analysis or more in-depth compartmental analysis of body water. I don't even know how you would measure subcutaneous water retention, but I think that would be very interesting because I do think a common thing that happens is people will be paying attention to scale weight. The scale weight will stall. They'll cut calories, and they maybe didn't need to. And that will result in a lower energy availability, all these negative knock-on effects. They try prep again, they include refeeds. And if they're one of the type of people that we see who tends to drop weight post-refeeds, that refeed keeps their weight loss more linear. And then, whether that's metabolic magic or something stoked in the fire, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, let's say we don't know, but let's assume it is water retention, that just prevents them from making those additional cuts, and they effectively get into stage shape on higher food with lower stress and less, worrying about am I plateaued. And I think that experience probably has knock-on beneficial physiological effects. So that could be it, or a large component of it, but we can't really tell that unless we can, discern that difference. So that's one little avenue I'd love to see explored. Some other things that I do notice.
Just to touch on that before you go on, because I think a lot of people aren't thinking of implementing refeeds upon like maybe an accuracy of assessment point of view, because I've had points, because I think a lot of us are very atypical bodybuilders that you push harder before you ever would pull back, and you get to that point in your diet where you're kind of stalling and you can tell like fatigue's higher. Let me just push and grind, because that'll get the job done, versus giving myself a day of pulling back, and then the mystical refeed magic happens and we flush this water and you look tighter and harder and all the good stuff. And then that would have not prompted you to make that harder decision to keep pushing. You this slight pull back, and you hear a lot of common things like, oh man, I ate this meal and now the next day my hunger's higher, or I was hotter during that day. And it's like, is there really, a lot of people attribute this like a metabolic increase, and is that true? Or is it just, hey, you had more food, so there's a larger thermic effect of food? And maybe there is some type of hormone signaling that does happen going to higher food amounts that the next day those are still intact. Potentially that would be an interesting avenue to investigate. But my thing that I wanted to branch off on what you said was it's almost a fatigue management strategy of increasing food for a day and dissipating fatigue, which would have this potential water loss as well. There's another side of it. Is like, what is the most fatiguing aspect while you're on prep? Is it the actual training volume that's in place through cardio or weight training? Is it the calorie deficit? And you've mentioned earlier the total energy availability, right? So for those that aren't familiar, this is the amount of like basically body fat stores you have, calorie intake you have, and calorie expenditure you have. So you have kind of three components to this aspect. And refeeds are working on one of these aspects. Body fat kind of, we're trying to make it go down, so that's not really going to be changing. But it brings up the question of, what if we work on the energy output aspect instead of the energy intake aspect? So rather than implementing a refeed when we notice fatigue is really high, because some people have stated that training volume is the biggest driver of fatigue. If you just have a complete rest day, does that have the same impact as just instead of, you keep your cardio and training the same, but you just eat more food? And because I've seen people argue, don't even do refeeds. We want to manage fatigue through training volume. You just lower your volume for a few days, or maybe you've been training beyond your volume. And so I'd love to get your take on that type of thought process. If you're noticing this fatigue and water retention increase, what are your thoughts on just lowering volume or training in some sense versus the refeed?
Yeah, I think manipulating training is something that is often really not on the table with any kind of creativity traditionally in bodybuilding. It's almost always like, it's going to be harder, so you train harder. Maybe we'll do higher reps and stuff that is, you don't feel strong. It doesn't feel safe to do heavy lifting at a certain point. So you do more reps, you do more volume. And I think it's almost sometimes this kind of like fear-based decision of, I got to do more. I look small. There's a lot of psychology that goes into it, but traditionally, even if that isn't psychologically driven, it is driven by the more volume makes you leaner, or makes you look leaner, brings cuts, etc. But nonetheless, it's very common to see the struggle to maintain volume and to try to train hard during contest prep. And that is like leg day when you're 6 weeks out is the PTSD we all share, right?
You're in the car before you go in and
yes. And you're like, maybe if I listen to 4 more heavy metal songs, then it's not going to be as bad, or I'll be able to get through it. And you fall asleep in your car listening to Disturbed, and you have to explain to your workout partner why you're late, and it's just weird. And you're like, I slept to Disturbed. That's crazy. So yeah, like that experience that has a unique effect. And I think I have really tried to, what can I do to get similar training stimulus would make it easier during prep? And that is one of the hardest sells in our community, where hard work is like the soul of bodybuilding. That was my main impetus for trying a full body split, where I would only have to do like 1 lower body compound, per day. And none of my days really trashed me. And I noticed for the first time out of the 4 seasons I've done, and I did a few other things differently, but the main thing that I did training wise that was different is I had regular deloads. I had a periodized approach, and I had full body training was my kind of template the whole time. And none of my individual days, I didn't utilize a lot of cardio. None of my individual days wrecked me or left me with a ton of edema or soreness. And I had better quad separation than I have ever had. And it went from being the unpredictable body part that I would, pray to gods I don't believe in, that they would look good after my peak or while I was peaking, to then I know no matter what, I've got my quads, they're going to look great, and they're my best body part. And that was like, that freaked Berto out. He was like, what's going on? Like, do you have some kind of strange disease now that has, taken away your ability? Like, it's just weird. Like, why are your quads out? We're way far out from competition, So it's almost appeared to change my body fat distribution. I don't think that happened. I do think it was related to stress and water. So I think I do use that perspective and framing when I think about things. And I kind of have a spectrum of fatigue management strategies, from let's have an impromptu deload, a day off, a refeed on and off day, or we're going to take a deload week with a diet break. And that's kind of like my nuclear option. If you just, you do your check-in and it looks like you're, oh my God, you weren't dieting for Bodybuilding Show. You've been in a concentration camp for the last week. What happened? Here's what we're doing. Chill out. Like you're eating every day is a refeed, and we're going to take we're going to train twice this week. Just 2 full body sessions, minimal volume, just do enough to maintain. And I kind of see that as a spectrum everywhere from, our regularly scheduled refeed, and then it doesn't matter what training is, just keep going. Although scheduling training around refeed strategically is a conversation we can have as well, to all the way to easy week of training and maintenance calories for the whole week. So 100%, that definitely goes into my calculus.
Yeah, no, I think it's an interesting perspective because most people don't pull that lever at all, especially training. Because I agree, there's like a machismo, like animal, like you just keep training and you tough it out, man. I've had preps like that because I thought that's how it had to be, and I had to be on the Stairmaster, and you can't just go walk outside and have leisure walking time. This is nonsense.
Might be gaining fat by walking and enjoying it. This is crazy. Yeah.
So I think all around fatigue management, there's an easier way to prep, and easier doesn't mean less effective. And refeed is just one of these tools that we can implement, which with implementing that, and you're having this assessment with your client. And one thing that I've done, I'd be interested to see like what you do if you weigh in the individual client. I'm sure you do on which route to go for fatigue management with a refeed. So say you have 2 clients, one's super low food, high hunger signaling, cardio is just moderate, and they're like, my legs aren't fatigued, I feel pretty good, versus the other client that's maybe they're dieting on more food. They're like, hey, I don't have a lot of hunger signaling, I'm handling this well, holy shit, my legs feel like they're stuck in concrete. And it's like, oh, we'll do a refeed, man. It's like, okay, but my legs still feel terrible. Or is it the other person that's like, I'm so hungry, we'll just do a little less cardio, they're like, I'm still so hungry. So yes. I think taking in individual client feedback can almost maybe self-guide what direction you might head with making up this energy, into a maintenance or a slight surplus. Is that kind of the route that you go with these assessments with your clients?
Yeah. Luke, I know we were on something. I could tell you wanted to speak. You looked right about to say something, and we're going down a new pathway. I want to give you the opportunity here.
So no, you continue. We'll come back. Mine's just my thing is the energy availability is where my interest is peaked with continued the process of researching this topic, because for me, like in an AO fashion, anecdotally observing, what I'm seeing is like a combined type of a process is typically the best result, with the consideration of what John pointed out. Is the individual a little bit more like heavy leg, plenty food? Is it like starving, legs feel fine? But a combination change that's both nutritional and activity based. And as we transition into, because like studying under Bill, I know like the biggest thing he always struggles with is nutritional guidance or adherence, right, with the studies. As we do transition into some of these populations, be a little bit more closer to what we considered contest prep individuals, will we see that total energy availability considered within this as something that I think is a more accurate viewpoint of what's actually happening, rather than just solely refeeds work or refeeds don't work, because there's no consideration a lot of times for total activity level when we read this stuff.
Yeah, no, I think that's really well said, and it actually dovetails nicely into where I was going to go with your question, John. And I do view it that way, and I think Luke's point is really salient, because when you come at it from the perspective of kind of body composition emphasized research, kind of like the ISSN crew, which I consider myself part of. It's all good, not hating, which Bill is obviously a part of too. And you come from that as well with the physique coach or physique athlete mindset. You have this very reductionist view on what will help me get to X body fat percentage and what will be a barrier. And the conversation is often around like metabolic adaptation, glycogen. It's all about these compartments, and it's pretty reductionist. And you would be surprised how 5 years ago, and I include myself in this, energy availability was not something that anyone really even was aware of. you know, like the IOC consensus statement where they're going, you know what, the female athlete triad, we think it fits in here. And they're having this whole debate. And they're like, no, we need to maintain female athlete triad. REDS, you know, relative energy deficiency in sport, that it's there, but everyone can, okay, well, the driver is energy availability. That can affect everyone, but they're not even talking about body composition, because back in the 90s, they had already established that women who have amenorrhea, it's not because of their body composition per se, it's because of them being in a very low energy availability. So they're having this whole discussion that's all based on, well, all right, what are the demands of your sport? And what is your current calorie intake? And how does that compare to your lean body mass? And we can predictably find, if we are looking at a very homogeneous baseline activity in like sedentary women, that's where most of this research has been done, that we have these thresholds that are decently representative of where we start to consistently run into issues. So you can actually do an energy availability calculation by looking at your energy expenditure from exercise, and then your kcals that you consume, subtracting that, and then strapped to your kilograms of lean body mass. So you can have like an energy availability of 34, which means that after exercise is subtracted for what you consume, average for the week, you're consuming 34 kcals per kilogram of lean body mass. And there's data that's showing once you get below 45 in high performing athletes and below like 30 in sedentary women, that's when you start to see more consistent reductions in like LH pulsatility, or I should say irregularities with their menstrual cycle, hinting towards eventual amenorrhea. That line of research, I would say most sports nutrition people, at least in our little body comp world, totally ignorant to. But what we were talking about constantly is this whole metabolic adaptation thing and the adaptive thermogenesis. Is it real? And everyone's like, no, metabolic rate barely goes down. And then we're like, but wait, that's not all of total daily energy expenditure. It's neat. And so we have this kind of very reductionist view, but there is literally no debate on the energy availability side. It's just about terminology. How do we emphasize it? What matters? And it is 100% well established, I would say, that if you consume far too low of calories, regardless of your rate of weight loss or what you're losing, et cetera, that there are effects, and they've been shown in various populations of athletes to coincide with higher rates of illness, so upper respiratory tract infections, amenorrhea, poorer performance, higher rates of injuries. So those are known things that come from just simply not eating enough based upon the demands of your sport. So there's that. Then going back to what you said, John, there's the overtraining literature, right? And this is kind of like, we don't think about overtraining in bodybuilding except for, yeah, that sounds great, I want to do that. But in general, like if you kind of just don't even think about energy intake, which is something that I would say most researchers in overtraining don't. They look at, are you eating less or more as almost a symptom, because that's something that's typically not prescribed. It is, are your stress levels modifying your auto-regulation of food intake while we're directly manipulating it, right? So the overtraining research kind of looks at this more holistically as well. Energy availability kind of looks at it more holistically, when we're very kind of just focused on these domains of metabolism. But the reality is that overtraining can be exacerbated by not eating enough. Energy availability is directly related to how much you're training in relation to how much you're eating. And then your change in body composition, I think, is the thing that we've really got that they're missing. So, John, earlier when you said energy availability takes into account body fat percentage, I agree with you. But the empirical evidence is not really connecting those dots yet. And that whole line of research that talks about it just from energy expenditure versus your intake per lean body mass, they don't see body fat. That's a non-entity. But the reality is leptin has like a 0.83 correlation with body fat percentage. So in my mind, how could it not be affected by body composition, right? I think, though, that there is probably a threshold point at which body composition does play a role, where it doesn't matter how much you eat or how much you refeed, you're going to have like you have a kilogram or two of adipose tissue on you. There's not going to be any leptin being secreted. And we've seen this in some of Bill Campbell's research, where they're looking at post-contest dieting strategies. And in the individuals who do get into at least maintenance or increased calories, but they don't gain body fat, they gain barely any weight, their leptin levels are in the toilet, their BMR is in the toilet, and they are basically still dieted despite the fact that they're not in a deficit. So I've been trying to merge all these concepts together to have a little bit less of a reductionist view. And, Eric Trexler has talked about this as well. And he was saying, the problem with a lot of these nonlinear dieting strategies and refeeds and diet breaks is that it's kind of like trying to study bee repellent in a place where there's no bees. Like, we can't know if it works. Like, yes, the study by Campbell is interesting, and these are reasonably lean people getting leaner. But I would say, like, with the modern conditioning standards that we have in bodybuilding, you have a solid 3 to 4 months where you are going from leaner than most people diet to in these non-overweight studies to even leaner than that. And I think that's where there's a gap. And I'm not, it could easily be construed as I'm just shifting the goalpost. Like, they weren't lean enough. Like the keto files who were like, but they weren't adapted yet. It's like, it's only 4 years. When are they going to adapt? Like, if I don't want to shift the goalpost to the point where this only matters if you're 4% body fat, but I really would love to see research in actual physique competitors, because I think it is pretty damn unique. I could see some other populations like wrestlers during in season versus off season or something like that, but there's very few sports, maybe sprinters, where you take people who are lean and they get unhealthily lean after that. And I think that has very unique effects on physiology, that this may be where this stuff comes into play. So that was a long rambling answer, but I think we do need to think of energy availability more broadly. Like, what is your intake compared to your lean body mass? We need to think about overtraining. Like, this, hey, if we know athletes who don't eat enough are more likely to show symptoms of non-functional overreaching and overtraining syndrome, that's the one time where people lifting weights to get bigger biceps might actually experience it. And how much are we just going, that's just prep? Well, it sort of does and doesn't matter. Like, if you just see this is the experience with prep, we need to manage that fatigue, that's great. But if you shift your perspective a little bit and you think, all right, if I was a sports physiologist and I was seeing overtraining syndrome in an endurance athlete or a team sport athlete, how would I approach this? It probably wouldn't be a refeed, right? I would have other tools on the table because I'm viewing this differently. All right, if I was a sports physiologist who worked with female athletes and I saw you had amenorrhea, that's not just, hey, it goes with the territory of prep. I mean, it does, that's true, but what would I do differently? Would I try to get them to diet on higher energy and see if we could slow down the pace? Would I be suggesting a later show? I mean, you can't always do that, but I guess what I'm suggesting is that we need to shift our frame of mind and our perspective to encompass these already well-established research areas and not just kind of look at it from the whole body comp, sports nutrition realm, because there are other tools in the tool belts of those practitioners that are rarely used or rarely thought of in the same way by contest prep coaches, even those who are well informed by the evidence.
That's really interesting thought process, and it makes me think too of like what you see out in the coaching world is like, what is that coach's background? Like, where do they come from? And maybe that's the application that they're putting into play. Like I'm a dietitian, so I'm probably looking at like, hey, let's refeed everybody, right? Or maybe your background was some type of sports psychology, and you're like, oh, they're fatigued. Maybe we should work on stress management skills and sleep routine or something like that. And so you might have a bias towards a certain approach, but really with what all we do within coaching, it's really multifaceted. And it's impossible. We're never going to be experts in every single area, but we have to have, be open-minded enough and realize that there are all these areas that do influence someone that's doing a bodybuilding competition. And there's so much involved into it and so much that we have at our disposal to utilize for people that we do coach. So I think getting, rabbit holed down into one area can really shut the blinders off to so many different other potentials that you could be utilizing as a coach to help your people get to that stupid shredded glutes, for weeks on end. And that's where the literature lies. So we don't have a lot of it, like you said, Eric, in these like super lean individuals, but I want to dig into like your actual application of this and how you actually apply. Because I know people are going to listen to this and say, okay, this is where this research and all this literature is, but what's my takeaway? Like, how do I know, like, when I am getting lean, to apply a refeed, what that might look like, and what are the things that I should notice when I implement this thing into place, and maybe touch on too, Eric, say there is zero effect for doing these refeeds, but yet we do a refeed on peak week, and we do reap benefits of that going into show. So some people say maybe you should practice that before you do it. So maybe just touch on that on the end too. But for your actual application, the people that you coach, how you do it, when you do it, and go from there.
Fantastic question. I love the way you framed that, and I'm glad you touched on that, because I was trying to figure a way back there when I had tangented us so off track. But yeah, so the way I view it is I try to think about maximizing the benefits and reducing any potential harm. So I used to be just like, hey, refeeds are evidence-based, because I have a bias, and I read the stuff that I buy into. Everyone's doing everyone's doing their 2 days or their 1 day and 2 days or whatever. What I do now, based on the rationale and the understanding, is that with refeeds, I use them as a way to reduce the deficit over time. So I do think there is a strong reason, or there's a strong rationale and solid empirical data to suggest that the leaner you get and the larger your surplus is, the more likely that a large proportion of what you lose will be lean body mass. So I would prefer to have someone dieting slower when they're leaner, so that I know that they can only metabolize so much fat at any given time. And if I sink a large deficit and somebody's only got, a handful of kilograms of fat on them, it's not all going to be fat that we lose. So I will often start someone closer to losing like 1% of their body weight per week, and they'll have, 1 or 2 refeed days at most. And then as we get closer and closer to the show and they get leaner and leaner, I'll slow down the rate of weight loss by adding another day at maintenance. So that the target deficit on a day-to-day basis on their low days stays the same, but the number of days they have in that deficit decreases. So I'm trying to slow down their rate of weight loss. Do you base that maintenance on what they initially started prep at, or are you trying to kind of adjust that along the way for potential changes in maintenance level with body weight dropping? A little bit of both. So okay. I think normally start with we started with, and I'm going to pick on, your low days only and leave your refeed sacrosanct. And then I will add more refeeds throughout. I do know that eventually I'm going from keeping them at maintenance to a slight surplus. I see that almost as like a feature, not a bug. But you may get to a point where you have to pick on the refeeds a little bit to bring the overall energy intake down. So I will see them as the second option to adjust. So, I mean, there are some people who will plateau within the first 2 months of going from losing, let's say a pound and a half a week on a bigger person, to that's only half a pound a week, and they're not super lean yet, metabolic adaptation, whatever you want to call it, reductions in NEAT, et cetera. Some people were in an overfeeding state and had an upregulated energy expenditure right before they started prep, and you think that's maintenance, but it's like this artificially high maintenance. So you take them down 500 and then they get into a very slight deficit. Super common. Someone who you have to push calories really, really high in the off season. So I think you do have to be agile in that way, because you don't know if you're dealing with someone with for lack of a better word, a flexible metabolism, which I really I don't think much has happened in BMR, to be clear. But they are more spendthrift for thrifty, I would say. So that is very much a case-by-case basis. Some people, they kind of just have their output and it goes down with body weight and not much more. And I'll get to some point like 3 months in, and the refeeds, I'll bring them down a little bit, just to kind of keep that pace where I want it as far as the rate of weight loss weekly. So often I'll go from like 1 refeed, 2 refeeds to 3 refeeds. And I will try to have, when I get up to 2, have them be 2 days in a row to try to get the benefit of being in an energy surplus or not an energy deficit for multiple days, as there is some evidence to suggest that does something unique to just the overall calorie balance across the week. And I use that as a tool to actually slow down the rate of weight loss. As far as diet breaks, I used to be like, separate. I had a system that I created that was just, I think, easy to follow, but I wasn't like dogmatic about it when I had my How to Coach Bodybuilders course in what used to be called the Shredded by Science Academy, that's now the PT Collective, where we would go from 1 refeed to 2 refeeds to 3 refeeds per week, and going from 1.5% rate of weight loss of your body weight per week to 1% to 0.5%. It's all nice and mathy, and it makes my OCD happy. And then separating each one of those periods where you decide to add another refeed is a week-long diet break, right? And that's maybe a useful model, but of course it should be much more agile. What I do in practice is that I will drop in a week-long diet break when we hit a stall, especially if I think the stall might not be real. So I normally operate off of a 2 to 3 week average of body weight to gauge whether we're going down, and I look at them visually. And I just think about the math, like how much could they be down regulating their energy expenditure? How much cardio have I given them? How many days per week do they train? And if I'm like, all of my experience and what I understand of physiology says you're probably in a deficit, I will give them a diet break rather than give them another cut in calories. So sometimes, like, I see it as, okay, what's the worst case scenario here is they actually have downregulated that much. I give them a week off dieting. That downregulation typically comes with feeling shittier, because that's, I think, the big missing piece between the whole I'm focused on metabolic adaptation versus the energy availability folks. They have this spoke, this wheel with spokes that go into almost every type of or compartment of your body and all the different systems, like immunological, endocrine, performance, all the different things we care about. They're all affected, and there's data to back that up from being in a chronic state of low energy availability. So even if it doesn't kick up your energy expenditure much, we know that you will feel less shitty from that week. And if weight loss then still is plateaued when we come back, we got a good week of training, we got some fatigue management. Okay, now I'll go into a deficit. But I would say more often than not, when I do implement these quote unquote auto-regulated diet breaks, is we'll get another spurt of weight loss, and it delays the point at which I would make a calorie cut or an increase in cardio. Now, I don't do this only from a plateau. It's not like I wait until they're only losing 100 grams per week, because then it would take 8 months to get in shape, right? I am doing this based on, are we meeting a target rate of weight loss on average? Because I think you don't want to be in a position where you're babysitting the fat loss process so much and trying to make it as painless as possible to where you're actually extending the time period to where that's not worth it. And I think that is, to steel man people who are more anti-refeeds, that is the biggest thing you do need to consider, is that I don't think most people respond so well to refeeds that it makes the same time course of prep the same, but you just get to eat more. I have had experiences where it's pretty close to that. People who do seem to respond to this much better. Maybe that's an adherence thing. Maybe, I don't know. You don't get to know everything that goes on in their lives. I find I do better with refeeds, and it seems to game the system a little bit, but I don't think I'm the norm. I think you do have to go right. I could diet them for 5 months more aggressively without any refeeds, or very few, or I could diet them for 7 months with refeeds and coming out of it. And then you have to gauge, okay, which one of those is better? Now, I think that kind of trade-off, 7 months versus 5 months, and maybe having a net overall higher calories, if you were to do the average over those 5 and 7 months, is kind of the experience I have. I say it's worth it. And I typically see better outcomes on stage, and people, when they retrospectively compare those preps, which of course has bias, but it sort of doesn't matter because that's your life experience. They tend to rate the slower prep better. Not everyone, but I think that is something to weigh up. And if you simply don't have the time to do it, or if you're getting behind the 8 ball in terms of timing, then I think you do need to go, right, this isn't the time to pull the refeed lever or the diet break lever, because I've got 3 weeks and you got 3 kilos to lose, So I tend to do them in this auto-regulated fashion, where I go, instead of cutting calories, adding cardio, if I've got the time, if we're on pace, I'm going to give you a diet break. And I would say the majority of the time, in my experience, that does result in another spurt of weight loss. That could be just water weight dropping. But the end result is that as a coach, I end up making a few less quote unquote unnecessary cuts in calories. And that's kind of how I implement it throughout.
So it's curious to hear you say that, especially with how you're approaching that start of prep, because it's a very common theme over in our realm to be very aggressive off the bat. I know some people that are 800, 900,000 calories straight off the top, no refeeds in play. But granted, I think that providing context to the timeline was important, because some people are going to hear this and think that, oh, we're still doing these like diet break things within 14, 15, 16 week preps, right? And they're most likely not setting themselves up from a timeline perspective to be able to do these things, right? Because a week in a contest prep is contextually a lot less percentage of the time to get there when we're out at 7 months rather than when we're like at the 16 weeks. So do you think that that's a large mistake we're making as coaches on this, the non-Illuminati side, if you want to say?
Illuminati?
Nah, yeah, whatever.
Yeah.
Alabama. I'm from Alabama. They accept my pronunciations.
Well, you know, I do think that there are certain things you don't, and okay, so first off, highly ignorant when it comes to coaching people who are on any anabolics. My perception is that we're in the Illuminati world. We're doing a lot of things to make sure that we can maintain whatever sputtering performance of hormones we have. Mm-hmm. We don't have the option to add hormones to the body exogenously. So I do wonder if like crash dieting has what I would define as crash dieting, losing weight super fast. It has a lot of negative effects that are independent of how much muscle mass you might lose because of that choice, in terms of how much do you binge post show, how much do you hate life, micronutrient deficiencies, etc. So it's generally something I wouldn't recommend, regardless of whether you're on gear or not. But you can guard against a lot of lean mass losses when you have support, when you're enhanced. So it's something that the juice may not be worth the squeeze, no pun intended, if there's juice involved already, right? So I think if you can go right, it makes more sense for me. Maybe I have like that, and it lines up with my personality. I'm going to push for 12 weeks, not do refeeds, not do diet breaks. I'll be losing at a faster rate. I'll be at a low energy availability. But the principal concern that the natural bodybuilding crowd has with why they're using these strategies is lean mass preservation. I have another tool that I can use to prevent that from happening. Fair call, and I think I don't know necessarily that is, I think from a bottom line perspective, if we wanted to be like the ruthless capitalists of looking at the only thing I care about is my body composition on stage, then you could make an argument that there's an overemphasis compared to what I do versus someone an enhanced coach would do. And I think that's fair. I do think, though, that when you look at this from a bodybuilding career perspective, there's very few people who, for a 10-year span, from going from amateur to pro to competitive pros, can suffer through every prep like it is a rocky montage. Eventually, that does start to make it just not worth it. And the survivorship bias we see of those who compete at the high level doesn't represent how many people are just dead bodies along the side of the road of them, figuring out a way to make it work. And you guys know this. Some people get annoyed when we harp on the shitty coaches and the people who don't care. But if they knew the things that we have talked about off camera, pushing drugs on people who have no business doing it too early, divisions that don't need it, giving these template diets that just kill people. And then if you don't make it, that's fine because you weren't worth it and you're not going to bring up my profile anyway. I'm only going to take people who are okay with taking a bunch of drugs and going on these crazy diets, and then only the strong survive. Great, I still look good as a coach. That shit still happens. And it's not quite as bad in the natural scene, but it's still there. There's a well-known coach I'm aware of who used to make his clients weigh in every night, and they had to reach a weight loss target, and they would cut water nightly to hit a weight loss target. That's crazy. That doesn't even make any sense. So that stuff is out there. And I think you need to pay attention to it, because there's so many people who used to bodybuild, but it was terrible for me or ruined my life, or I had to, go to the doctor and get some type of clinical treatment. And I do think that like, even when you're like, well, I don't need it because I'm on something that allows me to avoid that potential rationale. I think anything you can do to make the process more survivable means you might be able to compete later and longer in your life.
Which is the exact reason I brought that up, because I think our side can have a tendency to ignore what y'all are doing. And I think it's where we can learn the most about prepping. I prepped natural for my first 4 shows, and some of the biggest learning experience I've ever had, right? And I think that that's something that, as we have this conversation, like, I know some people will have a tendency to tune out because they think, oh, this is something that's just utilized on that side of the fence, right? But I think that and it's used within our realm, but like it's not done in an approach that's as critical as like, besides John, because John's the know-it-all over here. But
make it up.
Make
it up. That's all.
Yeah, and so that's my point, right? It's like that these are tools that we can be using. You just have to contextually be able to see where's the benefit, which is what you do a very good job of is finding the utility in everything that someone does.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
That's always been the draw for me to follow a lot of the natural competitors, because I've seen so much done to people that just drug use can mask shitty nutrition, shitty training, shitty application of all the variables that you apply. And then you have someone that gets to a point that they make progress, but they cap out easy, and they have built this body on drugs. And now to retrain them in all these other areas, it's so much more challenging. But then not to mention the longevity aspect of it, because, you know, I was younger in my 20s, it was one show at a time. That's your focus. Now I'm in my 30s. I'm like, how can I keep being a top level pro for the next 5 years? And it's like, well, you need to utilize all these tools to your potential. What are the naturals doing? You know, how are they maximizing? If they have to hold on to muscle tissue, well, gosh, if they're able to do that, holding on to muscle tissue, if you implement those strategies on top of being enhanced, man, that's probably when you see people growing into shows. Or what's a longevity aspect is using less drugs. You know, it's not like, oh man, my thyroid's, you know, function's decreasing. Let's just take thyroid hormone. Let's take fat burners and etc. It's like, well, if there's another strategy and maybe have a little bit of a safer use model that can let you do this for years, because just to let you know, guys, like, to get good at bodybuilding, you have to do it consistently for years. It's not just to one show. So if we can take some tools and look at the research world and what's working, why is it working, and apply those to ourselves, that's when we're going to reach our ultimate physique, because we're able to do it consistently for years to come.
If I may, I think there's a very similar calculus that enhanced and drug-free competitors make, and there's just a slight difference. So there's no bones about it. If you look at all the case studies on natural competitors, which there's a ton of, and if you talk to natural competitors, you get to the place of being unhealthy. So a natural competitor, if they're honest, they have to admit that they do place competitive natural bodybuilding slightly higher than health, and that they are willing to have some sacrifices in their health for their sport. And that's true among all athletes. It's just a slightly different calculus for enhanced competitors. And even among enhanced competitors, there is a range of that. Now, I've talked to many enhanced guys who are like, no, that guy's crazy. I would never do that. That's far too much, far too fast. And certain compounds I wouldn't even touch. And I think that speaks to, is everyone taking as much as they need or would benefit from, or are they covering up issues? And I can't tell you how many times I've talked to good coaches on the enhanced side, and they, like, a common anecdote that their clients have is, oh man, I've gotten better results, but I'm on only half or a third, or I don't even touch these things anymore. And I think that is a win. That is a really, really good thing. And it is a much more like harder core, if you will, version of when people on the natural side go, yeah, but I was able to diet on higher calories, or my post-contest rebound was different, utilizing all these various strategies, or my stage weight was higher, and it wasn't because I had a better off season, it's because I didn't lose as much muscle mass. Another thing I would say, to kind of dovetail off what you're saying, is some of these strategies get bootstrapped to the logistical nature of the competition schedule. So like when I work with a WNBF pro, unless they did really well at Worlds last year, they have to qualify for Worlds, and the locations and the timing and where they live and how much it costs, sometimes they need to do a show in like July, and then Worlds is in November. So they need to be in shape in July, and they need to be in shape in November. So, sometimes the conversations I have with other drug-free coaches is like, so do I put on some body fat after, or we just eat at maintenance? Like, what do I do? How good is this person? Can I get them not in shape, but decent shape, peak them well, and, rely on their symmetry and muscle mass to get like a place in the top 5 to get that spot at Worlds. And then we really go hard at Worlds. And those are the kind of concessions you have to make, because it sucks being in shape for half of the year. It is awful. And like most, whether you're enhanced or not, most bodybuilders aren't just making money off bodybuilding. That's reserved for like the top 5 in the world, only on the enhanced side. Like, I mean, you could do every single drug-free show as a pro and win, and you'd make like 10K a year, and you'd spend 5K on flights and the registration and paying for your drug tests. So you can buy like a used Hyundai from your money in drug-free bodybuilding. So like, if there's, you know, if you can't get off from your work, if it's something going on with your family, the calculus is almost always that I've got to make these shows fit in with my life. You know, like, you know, Philip Ricardo Jr. sat out of the Olympia one year because he had to go to Iraq. And, you know, for one of his colleagues, like, we're not really pro athletes. You know what I'm saying? Like, you know, we don't have the Nike sponsorship and who's, you know, putting us up so we can go compete in these competitions. So, you know, for me in 2019, when I was competing, I was trying to get my WNBF pro card. And I had to pick my spots. Like, okay, there's no shows in New Zealand that are pro qualifiers. So I've got to go travel to Hawaii in April. Okay. There wasn't enough competitors for me to get a pro card. No big deal. I'll go compete in July in California. Okay. Didn't win my pro card. So now what do I do? Do I hang out and try again and try to win my class at Worlds? Cause I did get an amateur qualification. Like, these are the things that make nonlinear dieting strategies also important. In addition to, I want to practice my peak week, and I can structure my refeeds, which, you know, you brought up, John. I think that's a really great, you know, feature of this is that you can, what I normally do is once someone gets in decent shape, I start asking them to send me pictures the day of the refeed, the day after, and 2 days after, and sometimes 3 days after if they're really someone who tends to like hold on to what seems like water. So I can get an idea of what does their loading strategy look like. So I used to be either like, oh, are you a front load guy or a back load guy, or are you like a, you know, tapered up? But I basically kind of do like this modified backload with a delay of being in maintenance. This depends on when do you look best. So it'll be more of a backload. If you look great on the day of and the day after a refeed, then it's pretty much just like maintenance and then spike you up on Friday and keep it relatively high on game day. If you're someone who has a kind of a shitty load look and then you come down and clean up, we're going to do this kind of mid-load where I load you on Wednesday and then tapers down into the show. That's kind of like me. I normally have my biggest load day on either Wednesday or Thursday because I look gross for a while after, at least from the waist down. So all that information you get from using refeeds. And you, like, let's say it does come out that there's not much metabolic magic happening here. There's not much physiological benefit. I still think that you would, knowing that we can refeed without really losing much, once someone gets lean enough, I would start having them practice and get used to these mock peaks on a week-to-week basis where they're still in the net deficit we want. Because that makes sure that, I mean, some of the things I worry about, like, well, we know what happens when you go on a low-carb diet. It actually down-regulates your ability to synthesize glycogen, you know? And I think you guys have probably experienced this. Have you ever tried to carb load someone when you've absolutely crushed them for weeks on end and it just doesn't seem to work?
Yeah, definitely.
I wonder what's going on there, you know? I wonder if it is that their body's like, oh, I've been using like ketones, air, and hope and glory for energy expenditure. I don't know how to use carbs anymore. You've only been giving me broccoli for the last 6 weeks. So I think there's a lot of factors that go in there that even if refeeds don't pan out the way I would like them to, and I hope they do, and that our anecdotes seem to support, that there is value in practicing those peak weeks, especially in competitors that don't have a ton of contest experience under the belt to look at. So yeah, all those factors go into it for me. And you know, the question of what do I do between shows when I have 2 months and I'm already in shape, you're going to have to use some type of nonlinear dieting strategy, even if it's just eat at maintenance for 2 months, you know? So yeah, I think these are going to be concerns regardless of kind of where the research goes to some degree, if we're going to keep using carb loading and if the contest schedule keeps being what it is.
I'm so glad you wrapped back around to that question, Eric. And you did it so beautifully. I'm like, wow, he just pulled right through. I was like, he forgot my question. No, that's awesome. Because I think that went a different direction without, you know, especially on safety and timeline of these things. Because this past year has been heavily deranged schedule-wise from COVID, because I started prep early in the year, then Olympia was in December, and then now you have to look at the schedule. It's like, well, when's Olympia? They're like, we don't even know yet. And it's like, well, when should I qualify? Like, well, I don't know. Maybe I should just stay a little bit lean and jump in a show, or should you prolong, being that lean, bring body fat up a little bit? And what does that look like? And I think you bring up a fantastic point that there is something to this periodized dieting strategies. If we can mitigate some of the potential down regulations in systems, or whatever it may be, to prolong what we need to timeline wise, because ultimately in bodybuilding, to be realistic, like our goals kind of come before all else, like getting on stage, being shredded. But still, there is ways to do this that have less health implications, or can have an ease to doing it and make it more enjoyable. And that's what I find too through the years of doing this, is that I've had preps where it's miserable. Like you want to put out that hell yeah, every day on prep, this is all great. But realistically, you have days that are like, why am I doing this? This is miserable. I hate it. And those are far and few between now. Like you can truly enjoy a lot of the process using a lot of the strategies, which for someone that's new, and don't just punish them. Like if you can make them enjoy the process, like that goes so much farther for when they get on stage and they can look back and have this value that they've gained from it, and self-development, and not just quit, because that might push someone to quit. But yeah, I think there's so much more to refeeds than just looking at an individual marker in a research study. And we touched on a lot of these great points today, and a lot that we can implement and take away from this. So Eric, I'll wrap this up. I just want to thank you so much for coming on and finally getting in front of the Dr. Eric Helms and exploring this topic. Do you have any final words on refeeds for takeaways from anything that you want to plug for where we can find you and learn more about what you do, what you put out?
Yeah, so I'm launching the refeed manual. I'm just kidding. I couldn't.
Ebook for sale.
Yes, $9.99. It's actually a subscription, so you lose access to it every day, and you have to pay another $9.99. But it's for your benefit. No, in all seriousness, it's an honor to be on. I really appreciate the discussion. I think the one thing I would suggest to everyone is that it's normal when you're drawn to science to be drawn to answers, and that you are curious, and that you're more analytical and you like quantitative things. Most of the people I engage with, they're obsessive in nature like myself, and they will take a limited data set and they'll want to make a strong conclusion. And I think that is actually fundamentally opposed to empirical thought, in that when we have a limited data set, we can only make limited conclusions. So I would urge anyone, whether you land on a similar side of the bias that I have, or belief in the existing data or not, to kind of cap the amount of conclusive thoughts you have on this, because this is truly a very emerging research area, especially as we apply it to the niche population of physique competitors or even athletes. So I'm just really curious to see what further comes out, and I would encourage everyone to be open-minded to what comes out, and myself included. I will probably implement refeeds differently if we find that there are limited physiological benefits, and it is coming down to changes in glycogen and water levels and psychological effects. That will be a really interesting find for me, because then I can plan these refeeds in such a way that I'm not trying to gain some physiological benefit that really isn't there or is not meaningful, but instead think of, all right, well, how can I use periods of not dieting to the psychological advantage, to the fatigue advantage to the individual, and how do I practice peak weeks in a way that doesn't or minimally impacts the fat loss process? So it would take a different form. And I think that's one of the benefits to where we can't just look at anecdotes, because there are certain things we accept. And maybe we go, what, the anecdotes are so strong, I know this does something, I don't care about the lab coats. But what if it does something for a different reason than the anecdote that you supply says it does? And it may fundamentally change how you use it to be more effective. And I think that is a very, very common thing when we try to merge science and practice, is that anecdotes typically fall short when we go, hey, I see this when I do this, and then just wait for it, some bullshit mechanistic explanation they have no evidence for. And that part then makes people make poor decisions. They add a layer of an unproven story to it that goes, well, then therefore from that, and they build this house of cards. It's all based on something that they actually don't know. When you just hold on to, I do Y and I see X, and you don't need to have that answer that satisfies the OCD soul, then you are able to be more open-minded, and you can go, oh, I guess it was from some other reason, and now I can be more agile in my implementation. So that would be my final words. And anyone who wants to learn to become a part of the Illuminati, just follow us at 3dmusclejourney.com and check out my stuff at Helms3DMJ on the Instagram. And that's it.
Luke, final thoughts? Close us out, man.
That was fairly comprehensive. I'm not going to follow that one up. I think it's time to wrap it up today.
All right. Well, for everyone tuning in, we appreciate the listen. J3 University Podcast. Talk to you next time.